Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Peace Psychology webinar. As usual, we will wait just about a minute so that latecomers can join, and then we will start the webinar. Today, our guest is David Swanson, and I will introduce him properly just in a minute. But I'm very happy that David was available and he accepted to join us. And yes, let's just wait a minute before I do the introduction. Okay, so let me start. Welcome once again to another Peace Psychology webinar. My name is Serdar Manjoğlu. I'm the president of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence. It's a long name, so in short, we can call it Society for Peace Psychology. Today, we are very happy to have David Swanson with us to examine military bases in foreign lands. David is extremely active, as some of you may know. He is an author, activist, journalist, and a radio host. He is the executive director of World Beyond War. It's such a nice name as far as an organization is concerned, and campaign coordinator of rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and hosts Talk World Radio. I highly recommend his blog. David was awarded the 2024 Real Nobel Peace Prize and the 2018 U.S. Peace Prize. He was also awarded the Beacon of Peace Award by the Eisenhower Chapter of Veterans for Peace in 2011 and the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award by the New Jersey Peace Action in 2022. David is on the advisory boards of Nobel Peace Prize Watch, Veterans for Peace, Assange Defense, Military Families Speak Out, Fields of Peace, and Peace in Ukraine Coalition. He is an associate of the Transnational Foundation and a patron of Platform Peace and Humanity. His latest book is titled, it's a very nice book, War is Still a Racket. Today, the title of David's talk is Foreign Bases, Understanding the Backbone of Military Empires. Before we get started, I have two important reminders. First, there will be time for questions at the very end. I think we will have about 15 minutes. Please leave your question in the question and answer box. I will read the questions and may group them thematically. The session is being recorded. It will be available on our website, peacepsychology.org, and on YouTube. So before I go any further, I would like to turn to David. And David and I made no effort whatsoever to do this color coordination. It was simply by accident. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for joining us.
We're not fans of the Netherlands, I guess. We're just well dressed. Okay, I am going to share a PowerPoint, and I hope that it works. And let me know if you're seeing slides. And as I go to look at my notes, hopefully you are still just seeing the slides and I'm seeing my notes. So I'm very, very happy to be here, very grateful and honored, and will do my best. And we'll run through a slideshow here and then get to any of the questions that have been put into the question and answer place. And feel free to ask me about anything that was just mentioned or anything at all, including, of course, military bases. So try to go to the second slide just to define what we mean. A base I'm considering any installation, facility, site that accommodates military personnel, weapons, logistical infrastructure that's used for training, information gathering, operational planning, command and control, administration tasks, weapons storage, or launching wars, anything related to the war machine. And a foreign base is then any base that's located outside the operating country, that's financed, operated, leased, rented, or temporarily accessed by that country, even if it's also used by the so-called host country, and even if it's not formally labeled a base, it's called some other name by the occupying country. So we're talking about actual existence of things here, not what any government chooses to call them or depict them as. And especially with foreign bases, but even with domestic bases in various countries, this comes down to doing our own research because there's a lot of deception and misdirection and simply secrecy around bases. There's the bases are there to spread democracy, but not a single base exists because the people from the occupying country or the people from the so-called host country have been asked to have any say in it whatsoever. And for the most part, nobody even knows what's going on. So who has foreign bases? As with incarceration rates or gun violence or various sorts of environmental destruction or all kinds of measurements of militarism, including military spending, you need one chart for the United States and one for the rest of the world. It's very hard to fit them on the same graph. This is why they're starting to talk about military spending as a percentage of an economy, not just because that maintains this pretense that it's some sort of public service, but also because you can then get the United States on the same graph with the rest of the world, even though it spends more than everybody else put together. Well, the same goes for military bases. The United States has hundreds of them in the United States, but it also has around 861 by our latest count. I'm sure it's wrong. It's constantly changing in other people's countries. And has them in a huge number of countries, about 95 countries other than the United States. Some of them are small, some of them are huge, some of them are massive gated communities with shopping malls and golf courses, and by the way, menial labor provided by people with second-class rights in their own countries at these bases. But Turkey, perhaps surprisingly to some, has the second highest number of bases outside of that country, although most of them are in one or two countries right next to Turkey, and the United Kingdom at 118. And some of those and some of the US ones are shared, and some of the US ones are also NATO. Russia at 35, India at 19, and most of these numbers for these other countries have shot up in recent years. I mean, it used to be almost all foreign bases were US, but the trend seems to be catching on with others. Where are the foreign bases? This is a graph that shows where US bases are outside the US, Germany, Japan, South Korea. They're packed into Europe, into Africa, into Western and East Asia and the Pacific. They're scattered across Latin America and Canada. They've recently just put dozens into Scandinavia and the Baltics. From Iran to North Korea, the nations that are most often discussed in hostile terms by the US government, including Russia, including China, are encircled by hundreds of US bases. There's a thick wall from the top of Scandinavia through the nations that border Russia and Belarus and all the way to Oman, dotting the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. and squeezed most tightly of all into Okinawa and the rest of Japan and South Korea. Alaskan U.S. bases are not counted as foreign bases, but the U.S. base, soon possibly to be multiple bases in Greenland, are, at least for the time being. Even demilitarized Iceland has 2 U.S. bases. One thing that military bases do is prop up bad governments. Bases are often nowhere near borders of countries. US foreign bases are in many of the most oppressive nations where they support the abusive governments of Bahrain and Egypt and Gabon and Iraq and Israel and Jordan and Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Thailand, Uganda, United Arab Emirates, and so on. A dozen US bases on a tiny island dictatorship like Bahrain can be more prominent and impactful than a larger number of US bases in a larger nation like Italy or Germany. Foreign bases have some common and predictable side effects. They create zones of prostitution, of drunkenness, of reckless, abusive, and criminal behavior, including sexual assault and rape. Beyond the obvious large-scale disasters of airplanes crashing into ski lifts or buildings are the small-scale personal crimes that cannot be prosecuted by host countries and add up to something of an epidemic in some areas, such as Okinawa, although also recently in the news in the United Kingdom, U.S. quote-unquote service people unprosecutable under UK law, crimes so-called handled by the U.S. military. Interacting with loneliness, frustration, and criminal immunity, there is often a culture of superiority, if not contempt, toward local populations. The people who speak another language, have other customs, are themselves subject to the laws of the land, and are sometimes brought onto a base to do labor for low pay while being afforded second-class rights on that base and being forbidden to live there or remain there after dark. There are lawless zones facilitated by bases, places like Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, secret sites where the United States government has felt empowered to violate all laws, to torture, to murder, to imprison without charge, trial, or notification, zones treated as outside any laws. And of course, kidnapping people in the United States often involves locking them up on domestic bases and then shipping them off to foreign US bases. Damaging the environment, bases and the weapons manufacturing troops and weapons transporting, the war rehearsals and the wars that they facilitate cause irreparable damage to the environment. The exhaust of US planes and vehicles causes major degradation of air. Toxic chemicals from bases enter local water sources. Jets create enormous noise pollution. The US military is the single biggest consumer of fossil fuels and producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Yet this is rarely acknowledged during discussions of climate change. In fact, the US insisted on an exemption for reporting military emissions in the 97 Kyoto Protocol. Most host country agreements were made in the years before many environmental regulations were in place. And even now, the standards and laws that have been created for the US do not apply to US foreign military bases. Facilitating conflict, not protecting or preventing, facilitating. While such capability can be described as defensive, nothing can cause those in the region's other nations to believe it. US bases in Romania and Poland significantly increased tensions with Russia, contributing to the development of the war in Ukraine. The US government went through the motions of claiming that those bases capable of launching missiles into Russia would be either targeting Iran or were simply jobs programs for US weapons makers or were purely defensive. These claims went over as well as anything said about Russian missiles in Cuba had gone over in the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis. US bases and troops have provoked terrorist threats, radicalization, and anti US propaganda. Bases near Muslim holy sites in Saudi Arabia were a major recruiting tool for Al Qaeda and excuse for the criminal attacks of September 11, 2001. Bases constructed as part of a so-called war on terror have been part of a dramatic and predictable increase in terrorism. And bases were, of course, used to start the 2026 war on Iran, which began with Israel saying, we're going to attack Iran, and Iran is going to attack your bases. And Iran attacking those bases, and the occupying troops fleeing and hiding elsewhere in those Gulf countries, making other locations also into targets, violating self-governance. Nations with foreign bases are not even permitted to know what sort of provocation or danger those bases may contain. The Australian government has publicly supported the right of the US government not to tell the Australian public whether or not there have been or will be nuclear weapons in Australia. Such weapons could be brought into Australia, and the Chinese or other governments could become aware of it, while the people of Australia, and perhaps even the government that supposedly represents them, could remain ignorant. This is a recipe for blowback, for hostility directed at a country for reasons its population has no knowledge of and certainly never asked for. More provocative than the mere presence of bases or of weapons of mass destruction on those bases is the exercises or rehearsals for war that troops stationed at such bases spend much of their time on when not engaged in war. And of course, environmental destruction is also kept secret and unknowable from host countries. Wasting desperately needed money. Bases rarely create sustainable, healthy local economies. Compared with other forms of economic activity, they represent unproductive uses of land, employ relatively few people for the expanses occupied, contribute little to local economic growth. Research has consistently shown that when bases finally close, the economic impact is generally limited and in some cases actually positive. That is, local communities can end up better off when they trade bases for housing, schools, shopping complexes, other forms of economic development. To make matters worse for host countries, the US president has recently demanded that more of them pay the US government for the privilege of allowing it to maintain its bases. Bases and the weapons and troops that go with them are a huge financial expense for a base operating country like the United States, whose government officials talk frequently about trying to save money, even while dramatically increasing military spending, which includes at least $100 billion a year for foreign bases. That kind of money could, rather than going into something nobody asked for, something that endangers us rather than protecting us, be invested elsewhere and do a world of good. And the current proposals are to get U.S. military spending to $3 trillion a year, not 1.5, as you may have heard, which is outrageous enough. And fractions of that could transform the United States and the rest of the world. The United States could make college free, make preschool free, give solar energy to everyone, take the whole place off of fossil fuels and not have to fight wars over those, as the current president openly says the wars are fought for, etc. I mean, it's almost unimaginable the things you could do, the tiny bits of military spending that could end starvation and hunger and poverty worldwide, and make the government that did it beloved rather than resented. There is a movement to close bases. There has been sporadically and in numerous places for many decades. And increasingly, there is unification and solidarity and sharing of resources and strategies. Dataclosebases.org is a website we've used at World Beyond War to coordinate local groups doing educational events, nonviolent protests, sit-ins, lobbying efforts, days of all kinds of activities, all on the same day each year. The anniversary of February 23rd, the anniversary of the U.S. creating the military base at Guantanamo. A rather unique base in that the country it occupies actually wants it out, not just all the people who live there, which is not unusual at all, but the government actually wants it out. Although this is true in places like Okinawa, where the local government often wants all the bases out, but the national, or in that case, Japanese government does not. Local people have built movements and taken action to remove bases, to prevent bases, sometimes with success, sometimes not. On February 12th, 2024, after years of struggle supported by World Beyond War and others, the Save Sinyevina campaign met with the Prime Minister of Montenegro and gained his promise that there would be no military training ground built at Sinyevina in Montenegro. This was to have been a massive and destructive project for the benefit of NATO and the United States military. And it now seems clear that it will not happen after people unarmed put their bodies on the line and did educational events and summer camps and lobbying and billboards and marches and sit-ins. And this is, what it takes. In 2006, people in the Czech Republic found out about plans to create U.S. bases in their country. They organized and prevented those bases from being built. In 2007, localities in the Czech Republic held referenda that matched national opinion polls and demonstrations, and their opposition moved their government to refuse to host a U.S. base. Of course, when you get a vote, you're likely to win it. And that would probably be the case as well if you could get a vote in the spreader of the democracy in the form of, armed encampments. In Colombia, also a popular movement has prevented construction of a base for use by the U.S. military on Providencia Island, and a new movement is trying to prevent a base on Gorgona Island. And Ecuador, of course, several years back with a different president, refused to allow a U.S. base to stay beyond a decade that it had a lease for, and said you could have a U.S. base if Ecuador could have a Ecuadorian base in Miami, Florida. And of course, that didn't happen. But now there's a new government in Ecuador that's been pushing to allow the U.S. to treat it as under the Monroe Doctrine. But the people of Ecuador demanded and got a public vote and voted late last year to not change their constitution and not allow foreign military bases. Several years ago, your past president, if I'm not mistaken, Roy Idelson, came on my radio show to discuss his book, Political Mind Games, How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. While you are here, I want to ask all of you to consider what research can be done into bizarre behavior of military base imperialism. It depends, of course, on acceptance of war and acceptance of nuclear weapons and of nationalism and of exceptionalism. But many in the war business say that technology makes these military bases irrelevant for wars in various regions. If so, then the bases are about occupying the so-called host countries, or they're about weapons profits, or they're about machismo, or they're about inertia and the iron law of institutions, that individuals care about their personal power within institutions more than anything else. Closing a base upends careers without advancing any careers, endangers weapons sales without generating any, benefits a foreign public, but not necessarily its officials, and benefits the occupier public only in ways that it would need to be told about and have explained to it. Is there a way to get uncorrupted or democratized decisions? Even when Trump seems to believe that withdrawing some troops from Europe would be a great way to punish Europe, he does not seem to be able to actually do it. The insane system withstands even the insane individual. Of course, governments aren't people. Even a deal that is clearly and widely understood to damage a nation can still benefit individual officials in that nation. But I don't think the motivations of such individuals are always limited to money and favors and bribes and threats. A lot of them seem to believe in military power and prestige, and to see themselves as more powerful occupied by another government's troops and weapons, especially nuclear weapons, as well as with many new weapons sold to them by their occupier, then as independent countries. At least they claim to believe it. But who knows what to believe, since they also claim that it's all about democracy, and yet not a single foreign base has ever been approved by either occupied or occupier. Why do the occupied people put up with it? Well, very often they don't. Sometimes, as we've seen, they succeed in their resistance. Prevention is much easier than elimination, but even elimination happens in places like Puerto Rico, in the Philippines, and so on. And sometimes the bases come back and they have to be eliminated again. But when they're there, they're normalized. They do provide jobs, even if something else would provide more jobs. People are told there are scary enemies, as there very well may be. People are told the bases save them from drugs and crime. And people are busy and have a lot of priorities, including reforming their whole government, not just its acceptance of foreign bases. So it's not easy. Why do occupier populations like the US population put up with it? Can it really be said that we don't know? When we watch sporting events and they thank the US troops for watching from 175 countries, we may not stop and really think about what the hell they're doing in 175 countries, but we hear it. It's there in the back of our heads. It's not secret. Do we like it? Do maybe some of us like it? Do we believe that the military acts in mysterious ways beyond our understanding, so we should get out of the way and ignore it? Do we think saying anything about it might be treasonous? Why do the troops do it? Here are some troops on a well-outfitted US military base in Germany. Well, we know that people join the US military primarily for economic reasons more than propagandistic ones. Do they notice the bubble they're in and what's outside it? Do they notice the mini apartheid states that many of these bases constitute? And do they bring that back home to the United States with them? There are all kinds of resources we've worked on at World Beyond War with other groups and individuals and schools and researchers, mapping tools that we are constantly updating, where you can spin the globe and click on a base and zoom in and learn about it. Campaigns, reports, films, videos, speakers, articles, images. We are constantly trying to update these and share these, and request everyone who's involved in this work to help us out in that regard. And that concludes the slideshow. You may be muted.
Unmute. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Some of the questions that you raised are very important questions that need to be discussed. And as we go to some of the questions that people are raising, there are also some questions that were posed to you by people who were unable to attend this webinar. They sent them via email. So I have two that I would like to start with. The first one asks whether when you're counting bases, you count, for instance, aircraft carriers or bases that might be, for instance, in the sky someplace. How do you distinguish between these bases that are mobile and immobile bases? So that's the first question.
Well, the short answer is no. When I refer to these tools that we have on the website at worldbeyondwar.org with a globe, and you can spin and look at the bases in map form and list form, these are all immobile, stationary, land-based, geographic territory bases. But I think the question is a very good one and suggests the importance of being aware of, if not necessarily squeezing onto the same web tool, all the aircraft carriers and all the airplanes and all the dreams of space bases as well, that are part of the extensions of empire and the provocations and the facilitation of wars around the world, because some of these aircraft carriers are as big and populated by as numerous personnel as some of these land-based bases, and they are taken to the coast of Venezuela or wherever and used as a portable military base. And when wars and occupations happen and countries are taken over, bases are very quickly built up and are almost mobile and are installed temporarily, sometimes with temporary energy sources, including nuclear, in somebody's country that won't be there in 10 years. These things always fail, but this is part of why the base map is always changing, and it's the airplanes and the ships are in some ways more dangerous. In some ways they're less dangerous because they aren't targets that are going to be hit the minute a nuclear war starts, so you have to hurry up and push the button to get in on the destruction with the other guy. But they also can be taken anywhere and threaten and attack and abuse anywhere. So there's it's a good question.
Okay. The other question that I received ahead of this webinar had to do with your own experience. This person said, I would like to know whether David has visited a US base, and one of your slides actually had to do with that. What does it feel like?
What does it feel like to be at a military base?
Yes, it's in a foreign land, if you have visited.
Well, I certainly have seen the outside of many military bases in the United States and abroad, including U.S. military bases abroad. This 4th of July, I sent a video to people who regularly protest outside a U.S. military base in Yorkshire, in England, actually an NSA spy base, National Security Administration, whose nation, by the way, it's not in the nation it claims to be securing. Anyway, I had been there a previous year because every 4th of July they have a celebration of independence from the United States, which they would like to have and dream about having. I used to live in Italy, and there was a huge movement. I mean, overwhelming popular support, not just in the relevant town, which was called Vicenza,
Mhm.
but across the whole country for preventing the, doubling in size of a U.S. military base there. And we did, marches through the streets and, educational fora and every sort of activism, and got public votes and won them and so forth. And it just didn't matter because the Italian government was a subsidiary of the U.S. government. And numerous times, what I've tried to facilitate is collaboration between activists in the United States, including in Washington, D.C.,
Mhm.
and in some place abroad where they're trying to put a military base or expand a military base. And of course, and we bring people from overseas and we go and we talk to the Congress members and senators and their staffers. And, these committee staffers know that some city is getting a massive military base years before anybody in that city knows it, years before anybody in that country's government even knows it. And you go and you meet with them and you say, we don't want this. We don't want the wars. We don't want to be a target. We don't want the destruction of our environment. We don't want the drunk drivers on our streets. We don't want it. And the only thing that any of them across the whole like 3 millimeters of the US political spectrum, the only thing that they ask us, that they ask these people who've traveled thousands of miles to try to stop this invasion of their homes, is, well, where do you want it? Where do you want it? Like, what country should we impose it on? Which town would be better? And, to their credit, a lot of these people say nowhere. We don't want it anywhere. This is not not my backyardism. This is war abolitionism. We don't want it anywhere. Um, I don't know what it feels like to be on a U.S. military base. I can't say off the top of my head if I've ever been on one, but I've certainly been at the gates of many of them. And it makes me sick. People. I used to always get this question of, why did you become a peace activist? And I used to always just get offended and say, why the hell did you not become a peace activist? Like, it's the worst thing
Yeah.
in the world. This is our top priority. We get rid of war. But I dug and scraped my memory to try to find some story to satisfy people, because I wasn't a war supporter who got converted or any of these things. And one thing that occurred to me, was that when I was a kid living near Washington, D.C., and one of my cousins came to visit from thousands of miles away, and he wanted to go see the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, where they train people to be in the U.S. Navy. It's like, it's a college, I think their football coach, either their football coach or Army's, is the top paid, person in the U.S. government. And it was such a beautiful day on this, basically a military base slash university, with the sailboats and the waves sparkling and the tourists and all the happy, people in their white uniforms learning to organize mass murder around the world, and all the monuments to ancient lies. They've got the mast there of the ship they lied about in Cuba in 1898 and so forth. And I got physically ill because I just saw all these happy, smiley people being trained to commit mass murder. Um, and it didn't occur to me to go sign up and join the peace movement, because I didn't know such a thing existed. There's no recruiting offices on every corner for the peace movement, but in looking back, I thought, well, yeah, it did sort of affect me.
Yeah. Well, we have a number of questions coming in. Looks like we have about eight. One question actually follows from the previous question. The person, the question says, are US soldiers on the same base all the time, or do they do rotations? And do they have their families with them? And we have
Uh,
other questions following.
there are people like Ann Wright on here asking questions who can answer some of these
Yes.
questions better than I can. I think the short answer is it depends. There are, but certainly soldiers, Marines, seamen, whatever you want to call the different types of troops. They often do tours, as they call it, of a location and then a different one. And in some cases, no, they don't have their families. In other cases, they do. And it's, I think, a very different experience for them and for the people who live around the base, if they have families, versus if they don't. I think families are actually good things when it comes to lowering crime and prostitution and drunk driving and so forth. But it's a very strange thing to be building these little isolated, segregated, walled villages with different legal rights and different classes of people performing different jobs, and schools and stores and restaurants for the permanent occupying army, and the local people, whether it's in the third world or Europe, have in different rights, and they have the right to pay money to build hospitals exclusively for their occupying army, and but not to know what's in their water table, what chemicals they're drinking. Yeah, I don't know. Does that help?
Yes, yes. So there's actually a very important question that comes, or actually has to do with Sinai, Egypt. There are two bases in the Sinai called the multinational force and observers that have polluted the land and air, offering support for military members, but not locals. How can we, as people who live in the US, promote justice for locals there? Are there other bases like this that are less known you can think of from the top of your head?
Other bases like this, meaning bases that are polluting?
Yes, like the one in Sinai.
I don't know of any that aren't. I mean, I'm not aware of any bases that aren't doing environmental damage. Many are doing incredible amounts of it. But I would encourage people to get in touch with me, David at worldbeyondwar.org, and see if we can connect local groups in Egypt or wherever with the global movement and with activists in the United States who can possibly help with bringing the same demand to the US government in multiple places around the world. Sometimes we can have an impact doing coordinated actions in multiple places, in Sinai or in Cairo and in Washington. We no guarantees, but we can try our best. And there are environmental groups, including some of the biggest global environmental groups, that typically won't touch war or peace with a 10-mile pole, that won't say a word against military spending, don't want a single dollar for the environment if it could go to murdering children, but do get involved in trying to protect military bases. And some of these campaigns that have saved military bases, most of the activists, you could ask them about peace or war, and they don't even know what it is and couldn't care less. Maybe it'll destroy us next week with the nuclear risk, but all I care about is the environment. And it's been that environmental activism, organized and ad hoc, that has driven a lot of these movements. And when you combine the environmentalists with the peace activists, with the sovereign rights of local governments activists, with the uphold the rule of law, with the we need the money for better things, with you can get a pretty big coalition if you do it right and bring in the right powerful people and don't scare off the wrong people, and So I think it's important to figure out all the downsides, environmental and otherwise, of these bases and strategize who can we get into a coalition to do something about it, and then take action in multiple places and see what comes of it.
David, there is a question that actually has to do with something that you said earlier. So let me read this. Are foreign bases legitimate targets based on international law? So when, for instance, the United States uses base in the United Arab Emirates to target Iran, does Iran have a legitimate claim to target the US base?
Well, I am not a lawyer. I can guarantee you that if you give me an hour after this call, I can find you a lawyer to argue yes and another one to argue no on that same question. What interests me most is morality, and I do not believe there is such a thing as a legitimate target for mass murder and reckless destruction. I don't think such a thing exists anywhere in the universe. It's just not a coherent concept. There's not such a thing as legitimate mass slaughter. There is such a thing as war making that's more defensive than other war making. There is such a thing as picking out which side is the worst. There is such a thing as, blaming the victims and avoiding blaming the victims. But there's not such a thing as legitimate war making, and we have to get to a world where we don't imagine such things, and obviously we in the anti-war community spend 99% of our time trying to get the United States to close these bases and stop these wars and not attack people in Iran or anywhere else and not blow up schools full of children and so forth. And you could accuse us of telling Iran what to do, except that we've never told Iran what to do, and Iran couldn't care less if we did. But there's a need for all of us around the world to learn the power of nonviolent activism, to learn all of the cases where situations where you'd be told there was no choice but war, people have succeeded with nonviolent activism, where we see what the people in Albania are doing in response to a single disastrous Trump project, and we've got 18 of them a week here. You see what the people of Bolivia are doing because they elected a government that didn't keep its promises. The U.S. government hasn't kept a promise in my lifetime. You see what the people of Korea did when they tried to put martial law in place in Seoul. You see what the people in, hundreds of cases, including foreign invasions, coups, occupations that are undone, believe it or not, by nonviolent activism. And there's this denial of that knowledge that's as dangerous as the denial of climate collapse, the denial of the power of nonviolent action. And so when I talk with friends in Iran or anywhere else, I encourage them to look at the facts, to look at the studies of what's most likely to succeed and what's most likely to backfire. And you can say, well, Hamas attacking the Israelis was legitimate and justified, and who's worse? Well, the Israelis are worse. But when it was predictably going to get the people fucking genocided, and you could predict it, and you did predict it, and it's not glorious. It doesn't make them worse than Israel, but it's not justified. It's not legitimate. It's not glorious.
Okay, thank you. There is a question that has to do with the history of bases in foreign lands. So the question says, when were most or many of these bases developed? For instance, perhaps after the Second World War or following certain wars or under particular presidents?
Well, the the biggest growth in anything bad in any field is related to World War II, the single worst thing humanity has ever done to itself in any short space of time. But President Roosevelt was trading goods and supplies to the United Kingdom for its bases prior to wasn't prior to World War II in his mind. He was planning on World War II, but he wasn't telling anybody yet. And so before, during, and after, and as part of this shifting of imperialism from the UK to the US did acquire a huge number of bases. But the ending of that war was also a case of closing many bases. And so there have been periods when numerous military bases, including all of the bases in some countries, including the occupations of some countries, like the Philippines, have been ended, not so much because of activism as for other, geopolitical reasons. And these are cases you can look at and study and see the absence of the disasters that are predicted should a military base close. It's entirely possible to transition out of a military base into something else with nobody and nothing damaged in the process. But I mean, a lot of I think a country like Turkey having a lot of military bases has a lot to do with turmoil in Syria and neighboring countries. Countries that have a handful of military bases around the world have a lot to do with, Canadians wanting to be as big and tough as the US, or, the calculations of governments that think they should all have a base in Djibouti, but the US, yeah, it's a lot. It has a lot to do with this decision that the elites in Washington, D.C. made in the middle of World War II, that they were going to rule the world. That's never a decision that's never been reversed. And as they're trying to rule the world, and they have the world segmented into the Southern Command and the Central Command and the Pacific Command, bases are a big part of it. And, this is where they've come from. And, having a base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, like Diego Garcia, that means a lot to these people who are spinning the globe and trying to figure out how to rule every inch of it. And so when the people who were evicted, they evicted the entire population, the US and the British, when the people get a court ruling that says they're supposed to get their land back, Trump is outraged, because the important thing is the military base. People mean nothing. People mean absolutely nothing. This is the guy who I read yesterday was letting the Iranian government pick which Iranians asking for asylum it wanted sent back so they could be tortured and murdered. People mean nothing, but the military bases mean something to these sociopaths.
David, we have a number of very interesting resources that are being sent either as part of questions or separately. So let me read the very first one. It says, I'm wondering whether you are coordinating in your mapping tools with the mapping also being done by the US NATO Out of Our Americas campaign. I also know that Black Alliance for Peace and that campaign have a similar mapping project.
I'm not sure. We certainly are very, very interested in every speck of information we can find and gather. And I certainly am a fan of Black Alliance for Peace and of the campaign we work with them on for a zone of peace in Latin America. And I'm certainly involved in anti-NATO coalitions that are doing great work and need to be in these days. But I'm not 100% sure, but if anybody will send me the links, or if you want to send me all the links that were in in the questions and answers afterwards, I will look and respond.
So thank you. There is another question that has to do with something uh, from the US, from the TV. I saw a segment on The Late Show where Stephen Colbert visited one of the military bases in Greenland. Does something like that help or hinder the work you are trying to do?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure if I saw it, so I can't say. It could help, it could hinder. My I'm a pessimist. My guess is it hindered. My guess is that there was a little bit of disrespectfulness and jokey comedian stuff, but generally, uh, down with Trump, but up with the U.S. and its military and so forth. I hope I'm wrong. This is someone kicked out of his job by Donald Trump. This is someone who's an enemy of Donald Trump, but not an enemy of imperialism, not an enemy of militarism, not an enemy of glorifying the service of organized mass killing. And so it's kind of hard to say, was it more jokes about Trump or more jokes about the people of Greenland or the people of Denmark? I don't know, because I didn't see it. But any almost any news is good news because nobody knows, nobody's aware that the U.S. Not only has this idiot in chief who wants to take over Greenland, but the US already has a military base in Greenland. And Greenland is already poisoned by old US military bases in Greenland that have never been cleaned up. Nobody knows that. And so to tell them the US already has a military base in Greenland, why? Because Greenland is on Earth and the US has military bases everywhere. That's educational. For people don't learn that in school in the United States. And so if the jokes weren't too insidiously supportive of the imperialism, then it was probably a good thing for some people to just learn about it.
Exactly. Well, in fact, let me interject with this bit. Greenland was such a highly militarized place during the so-called Cold War that it was actually the base where B-52s were based, and they kept flying 24 hours every day to basically show this huge nuclear force. And one of these B-52s actually crashed in Greenland and had a nuclear spill. And it was only with a very strong pressure from the government of Denmark that there was some kind of cleanup. And this very base and the nuclear weapons were actually uh, were built and were actually maintained by a secret agreement between the US and the government of Denmark. The people of Greenland never any say on this. We
Yeah.
are running short of time. We can go another 5 minutes or so. There is a very important piece, which is actually an experience that is shared with us. So I would like to read it. It says, this is not a question, just a reflection of my time living on a naval base located in Yokosuka, Japan. This was in the 60s, so it might be different now. Our base was huge and had nuclear submarines. On the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, we kids were told not to go off base. There were demonstrations by the Japanese at the main gate. The Marines, who patrolled the gates, beat the Japanese protesters up, who tried to climb over the fence. Our base was like a suburb. So this was an important experience, and there are actually many accounts of this sort. There is another important question that I think actually bears on this very webinar. It says, how's your experience aligning with academics, students, in other words, with people who are in the universities? We observe a backlash from universities and other higher education authorities against peace work. Has your organization, World Beyond War, found unfamiliar campaign tactics that could actually inspire us?
Um, yeah, well, great. The first comment was an excellent one because this is an observation from someone who was inside a base who saw
Yeah.
the protesters outside. And there are many cases of peace activists who have been great peace activists for decades who used to be in the US military and saw protests outside the base and took a flyer and read it and years later considered it again and came to a realization because of the protests happening outside the bases. That's useful. Universities like religions or governments, are part of the culture, part of the zeitgeist. They go with the flow. They are threatened and corrupted, but have heroic resistors and creators. World Beyond War has managed to create a number of online courses and worked with some universities to facilitate providing them. We've spoken at numerous conferences. It's actually very, very easy to get a room of students or non-students of anyone, and at the beginning of the session ask them if they think wars can ever be justified, and get almost everybody saying yes, and an hour later get almost or entirely everybody saying no, because you simply provide information they've never heard in their lives, but it's harder to know whether that change lasts. There is a field called peace studies that is just mushrooming like crazy across academia, but almost none of it has anything to do with peace or war. It mostly becomes anti-racism, anti-sexism, all the good causes that we all know and love. But like a local peace and justice center, once they add the "and justice," it almost never says a word about war again. And so it's a struggle. But we are publishing books and trying to get those books into more classrooms. There are countless wonderful professors who do have somewhat safe jobs at universities that work very well with the peace movement. There are all kinds of academics and economists who help people understand budgets and weapons and so forth. But I think what we really need from academia that we're not getting is philosophers who will push people to a different understanding of how we're supposed to live in this world, and what we're supposed to do with these myths that war is necessary or justified or beneficial. And how can we even have a language where we aren't constantly speaking as normalizers of war, where we don't do a webinar and have somebody tell me that I really killed it, and I was the bomb, and so forth. We need culture changers, and we need academia to be changing our culture, and right now it isn't doing nearly enough.
David, we have a couple of minutes left, but there is a question, but this question can actually start you for a rather long answer. So I would like you to answer it in a rather concise way. It says, I would like to hear David's position on the so-called rivalry with China with the US imperialism. How much should we worry about the possible replacement of the US military presence in the world by the military presence of China? What is your position?
Well, first of all, I think it's sad and pathetic the extent to which every member of the U.S. Congress, maybe a few exceptions, and many people in Washington D.C. think that their own self-importance and pride and individual identity is dependent on who has more power and money, the US government or the Chinese government. I have to confess, I can't imagine how I could possibly care. I just think my identity is completely separate from who has more money, the US or China, and why the hell a country with 4 times as many people shouldn't have 4 times as much money eludes me. The problem with replacing the US military with the Chinese military is that it's a military. The problem with China threatening to put its nukes on hair trigger alert, like the Russians and the US have always had, is that it might kill us all. The problem with China as a threat to some of its neighbors, even though that's dramatically exaggerated and lied about by the US media, and even though the US is a major threat to China, is that it's abusive and hostile and risks death and destruction. What we need is leadership in demilitarization, and we're getting that from China in leadership on moving to renewable energies, that you're not going to block a strait where somebody's trying to ship through sunshine and wind, and you're not going to start a war over it. And if anything good can come out of this war on Iran, it can be that it can be moving toward clean energy, which China, as one of the top two destroyers of the planet, is doing, and the United States is doing the opposite. But that doesn't mean I want Chinese military bases or Chinese weapons or a balance of powers. We need international law equal for all. We need an international criminal court where the officials aren't sanctioned by the U.S. or thrown out of their offices because they prosecute Israelis. We need China and the U.S. and Russia and France and the U.K. demoted to equal countries among others. We need the veto taken away from the so-called Security Council, and we need these larger countries to follow the smaller ones that are adhering to international law and signing and ratifying and upholding treaties in the way that these larger ones are not. So I just encourage people not to look for heroes in governments in Washington or Beijing, but look to the wonderful people of China and the United States and the rest of the world, and see if we can rein in these most destructive governments. I mean, I don't put China at the same level as the U.S. or even Russia, but it's a government that has lots of abuses and problems and needs to be dramatically improved. And we need to dramatically take power away from these nation states and these militaries and put more of it into local hands and some more of it into international hands, if we're going to survive.
David, thank you. I think we answered about 15 questions, and we still have about 10 to go, but our time is up. And one of the comments have to do with your performance, thanking you for your engagement and the wisdom you have offered. And I do thank you on behalf of our society that is promoting peace. So, as I said at the very beginning, this webinar is recorded and we hope to put it on YouTube as well as on our website, which is peacepsychology.org. And I would really appreciate if you would consider joining our society. Please go to peacepsychology.org to have a look. And I think we'll have another webinar toward the end of the month on the 29th, focused particularly on the persecution of minorities in India, which is a very important growing threat at this point to huge numbers of people and to peace. So, David, thank you very much for making the time and actually offering us a lot to work on. And I wish us all peaceful days and a world without bases. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye
Thank
now.
you.